So I've been thinking a lot about the Trump tariffs. We all have. The markets have. And as the markets do what the markets do. They price it in, they price it out. They make predictions about what will happen. I took a step back and I started thinking, okay, not in terms of what this may mean for the economy and GDP and inflation, what it may mean, what the motivations may be in terms of Donald Trump himself as a strategist, as a negotiator, core to his self-identity. And there are examples of him negotiating successfully in many deals. There are certainly examples of him not doing so. There are ubiquitous examples of him telling us that's what he's doing and telling us that he's such a successful negotiator. Sometimes the facts bring this or back this up. So let's talk about Trump's negotiating tactics and strategy. And I have some theories, and I know so too does my guest, Barry Nalebuff, who is the Milton Steinbach professor at the Yale School of Management and is the author of so many books. One I have here is one that he was on the show for, Split the Pie, A Radical Way to Negotiate. Hi, Barry. Welcome back to The Gist.
Well, thanks for the honor. And in that regard, I've comprised a little limerick for you.
Okay. Now maybe we should end with this and build up to this. But Barry is also one of the founders. I'm holding up many products on our video. He's one of the founders of Just Iced Tea. And they commissioned a poet. They, are patrons of the arts. And they commissioned a poet to write some limericks on their cans and bottles. This is what they're known for. That poet was me. I'll read you one of the limericks I wrote on one of their cans. But okay, do it now, Barry. Give me your limerick.
Thanks for having me back on The Gist. I just hope my dean won't be pissed. Chatting with Pesca beats tripping on ayahuasca. Let's talk about tactics Trump missed.
Wow,
and
yes,
what he got
let's. Right. And compliments. I know you're a canned beverage man, not to rhyme Pesca with Fresca. It must have been very tempting, but to go on the ayahuasca, I'll allow it. So here's, and that was great. Here's what I was thinking. Trump wants to reestablish some credibility, if you want to call it that. There's probably a better word for it in negotiation world. Mm-hmm. But Trump knows that he had a couple of series of tariff threats and he backed off. Yeah. And he probably, I think, wanted to say they need to take me more seriously and not to think that I will always back off. Mm-hmm. He probably also, before this round of tariffs, looked at the markets and saw that the markets were doing well, which you might think would please him. But the reason the markets were doing well is the markets generally discounted how serious he was about going through with his tariffs. So do you think there's anything of that sort going on in the Trump mind?
Yeah. Let's start with what it means to take an extreme position. So a lot of folks, and Trump in particular, believe that you should start off with an extreme anchor. It's just something that's sort of way away from where you end up. And there's some view in behavioral economics that works, that you somehow change people's perception of how many countries there are, African countries in the UN. If you ask people, is it above or below 10 or is it above or below 100? The problem is those extreme anchors in negotiation can backfire and you can get sunk by your own anchor. So in particular, let me pick one of my negotiations. Somebody wanted to sell something to me and they started with an asking price of $2,500. And I tell them I can get it elsewhere at $1,300, and they come back and say, okay, $1,100. So I have two views right away. One is, if they went from $2,500 to $1,100, they're going to move again. And when they say this is their final number, I don't believe it. And I also realize that they're trying to take advantage of me, because the $2,500, if I had said yes to it, I would have been a real sucker. And I think the same thing is happening here, which is, by taking such an extreme position, which nobody believed was actually going to happen, he was then forced to make a U-turn, a very large move. And now when he says, I'm going to stick to it, I'm not sure people, have any reason to believe that.
So what he has to do is what he did with the announcement of the tariffs, or he doesn't have to, but it would fit in with this way of thinking. I'm going to come in with shockingly high numbers and stick to my guns, or seem to stick to my guns, for a few days, even in the face of a huge market sell-off.
Yeah, and he did it for just a few days. So let's take a step back and ask, what is the objective here?
Right.
Because how effective the negotiating tactic is depends on what you're trying to achieve. And there could be four different outcomes that you'd like. One is that you're trying to get other countries to go to a zero tariff against the United States. Another is that you're trying to raise money from tariffs.
Mm-hmm.
Another is you're trying to move to an autarky, a situation where we basically don't have trade across countries. And the last is you just want world leaders to line up to kiss your ring. Mm-hmm. And it's about an ego trip, and you want to get a lot of headlines.
Yeah.
So if your goal is to get zero tariffs from the other countries, actually his approach could be very effective for that. As he says, there's 75 world leaders who are ready to say, Vietnam, Israel, whatever, zero tariffs.
Right. The willingness to show that we, as the United States, will take pain. We have more resources. We're going to inflict pain upon you, and your negotiating or partner will conclude it's in their rational best interest to go down to zero.
Absolutely. Now, of course, you didn't actually have to attack everyone all at once to make that happen. You could have just picked a few examples, like go after Columbia University, go after Paul Weiss, just kind of make an example of a few people. Mm-hmm. And then everybody else would also have fallen in line. So why go after the whole world at once? And I think the answer is, well, you just want the image of the 75 world leaders lining up to kiss your ring.
Right.
Now, if your goal is to get zero tariffs, that's fine. And like I said, we're well on the way to doing that. But then you're not going to raise a lot of money from tariffs. And so you can't both have zero tariffs and use tariffs as a revenue source. Plus, the tariffs were so high that we were on the wrong side of the Laffer curve. Right? You're not going to get any tariffs from Jaguar Land Rover when they stop sending any cars to the United States.
Yeah. And explain, if you will, the curve drawn by Arthur Laffer on that fateful napkin that day.
Yeah. So the idea was that if you have zero tax rate, you certainly don't raise any revenue. As you start raising taxes, you raise more money, but at some point you raise taxes so high, people stop working.
Yeah.
And so then you don't raise any money again. And here, if you raise tariffs so high that nobody sends things to the United States, well, then you're getting a high rate on zero volume. And again, you make no money. So there's some tariff number which could maximize tariff revenue. And he went well beyond that.
Okay. So I want to maybe pose my questions and acknowledge I'm doing so with maximum beneficence towards Trump.
Sure.
It is true that that it is contradictory to say, as Peter Navarro did, this is great, we're going to put $6 trillion in the Treasury because of this, but then to also say this is great because we're going to get our trading partners to negotiate, because once they start negotiating, that $6 trillion starts going down. So that's at odds. On the other hand, strategically, tactically, from a negotiating standpoint, if you really did want to negotiate, wouldn't you tout how great it's going to be that you're putting $6 trillion in the Treasury? Wouldn't you want to give the appearance of, hey, look, I don't have to budge at all. I'm happy with my $6 trillion that's going to be coming into the Treasury. At least saying that publicly does seem to actually not contradict, but dovetail with the goal of spurring a negotiation.
Well, again, you wouldn't pick tariffs that are so high that you're not going to bring $6 trillion into the Treasury. You'd pick numbers that might maximize the tariff revenue here. And I said he went well beyond that in terms of the sizes that he was talking about.
Also, I have also heard the criticism, what I just said, that it's self-contradictory to talk about the amount of revenue you're going to gain from tariffs, but also talk about how they're a negotiating tool. And, he has different factions within his administration. They were all very happy to publicly proclaim that theirs was the true faction. But I think about sin taxes, right? The idea that here's what we're going to do. Smoking is bad, so we're going to put a tax on cigarettes. And the great thing is all the revenue from cigarettes is going to go to schools, right? Or smoking cessation policies, but also, and
or lotteries.
ads.
The money
Yeah.
from lotteries is going
Right,
to
the money from
support
lotteries
education.
goes to school. But I don't think lotteries are a sin tax. I want to think about something that's a sin tax, which is we want to, A, stamp out the behavior, but B, maximize the revenue from the behavior for a social good. It is true that all economists will point out that those two things are at odds, but they don't quite. I think they're a little more gentle than a lot of economists were when criticizing how at odds maximizing revenue and fostering negotiations were with the Trump tariff.
I mean, look, we're happy to have some amount of smoking, and to the extent we have it, we're going to make some money on it. Same thing with alcohol. And you could say we want to have some amount of trade, and we hope to make some tariff revenue on the amount of trade that we want to see persisting. I got that. But these tariffs were not designed to do that.
Right.
They were designed to stop all trade and disrupt everything. And look, I get the idea of moving manufacturing back to the United States, but let's be clear. We're not going to be making T-shirts in the United States, and we're not going to be assembling iPhones in the United States. And it's going to take years to get manufacturing to come back. And so things like building chip factories. Okay, I get that. That makes sense. So you want to have a policy which encourages stability because people are making investments. They're going to go over multi-years. And you realize that not all components can be made at the same time. And so therefore, the fact that you can import some of your ingredients, some of your components, is also going to be critical to moving manufacturing back to the United States. A good negotiator has patience. And I'm not sure that that's what we're seeing here.
Would you say that the proof positive, you don't even have to have subjectivity, the proof that this was a poor negotiation is that he had to back off it because huge market sell-offs?
Well, again, if the objective is simply to get other nations to go to zero tariffs, I think he can achieve that. I think he did it in a way that was more costly than necessary. But nonetheless, if that's your final goal, we can declare victory on that.
Yeah. There is another component. There's a z-axis to this graph, which is the political component. So I don't know if there's an analog to when you're selling a house or, pricing ingredients for iced tea, let's say. But Trump in a negotiation wants to get what he wants to get out of the negotiation, but he also wants to appeal to the public.
Absolutely.
So, yeah. So if saying something maximally that could be damaging to your negotiation also is so thrilling to your base or somehow gets you elected, there might be a logical reason to do that.
Exactly. So let's look at the negotiation over who's going to pay for the wall. And he says Mexico's going to pay for the wall, the extreme position. And the end result is the Mexican president cancels his trip to the United States. And the U.S. pays 100% for the wall. So it was negotiation over how the wall is going to get paid for didn't work at all. But as a tactic to get elected, it was brilliant.
Right.
And so absolutely, there's two audiences here, and the scale of how much we pay for the wall is irrelevant compared to him getting elected.
Right, but I would say that's different. The wall rhetoric and whatever policy was attached to it is different from this in that, well, we all know the history of how he even injected that into his speeches, and he said it once at a rally and he didn't quite believe it, and it got a huge reaction, and he's like doing a real-time focus group, so it became one of the greatest hits that he'd have to say at a rally, and it probably, you're right, it did help him get elected, and he probably never had any kind of policy attachment to it to begin with. With this, he wasn't so specific. He didn't have one line saying, and we're going to tariff everyone a baseline of 10%, or we're going to tariff the herd in McDonald Islands with their penguins 10%. Yeah. He could have come out with what you're talking about, a much more reasonable, rational tariff policy, and still lived up to all the rhetorical commitments he made during the campaign and his whole life.
So this is the world has been beating us up. They've been treating us unfairly. And so we have to hit back, and we hit back hard. The problem is Most negotiation strategies are incredible when you say, this is going to hurt you more than it hurts me. Well, okay, but it's hurting me, and so I don't want to do it. And Trump has been so far a master with his unpredictability of taking actions that hurt himself, that you otherwise would think people find incredible to do.
Yeah. Also, international trade is a win-win, should be a win-win. I mean, he was talking the other day about how unfair it was that China, quote, made $1 trillion in trade. But we got $1 trillion in goods. So they didn't make $1 trillion in trade. And in fact, the goods that we got, had we had to produce them, would cost us more than $1 trillion. But he does think that trade, I guess he thinks that everything can't be win-win. And maybe in, I don't know, real estate, I don't even know if this is true. There are probably some zero-sum negotiations, but I would think, but you tell me, you're the expert, that trade is very much the antithesis of that mindset.
Yeah. So, look, I believe negotiation is ultimately a win-win. That is, if you don't do a deal, both sides lose because there was something you were trying to create through the negotiation. And it's true that among the different deals, they're win-lose, but doing a deal, getting an agreement, creates value that the two parties can share. Now, in terms of trade, I think it's been oversimplified saying that it's all win-win because, in fact, the sum can be win, but there are clear losers that take place, whether it be the automakers, the union workers in Michigan, the Appalachia, they were worse off, and we didn't take a policy to protect the folks who are going to be losing from trade. And so that's one of the reasons why many people have become anti-trade.
Yes.
And
it might be net win-win, but that doesn't mean all the factors that go into the net on the domestic side, all of them win.
Yeah. And let's be clear, people for a long time didn't understand where they were seeing the win. Think about how amazing a TV you can get now for $200. And zero TVs are made in the United States. And when suddenly people see the price of TVs going up to $1,000, they'll say, wait a second, time out. I actually kind of like those cheap TVs. But they're not particularly good at doing the counterfactual of understanding what would happen without the trade because they've never seen that. They see the negative things, but they don't know where the positive ones are coming from.
Stylistically, Trump always says that his predecessors were naive and allowed for all these bad trade deals to go through. So he has to come in with radical plans, big plans, plans that clearly cause pain, maybe even domestically, but certainly to our trading partners. How much truth do you think there is to that?
Well, in some cases, I would say the deals may not have been ideal. And look, he renegotiated NAFTA in a way that you could argue was a better result. But then, of course, he blows up his own agreement. And so he's critiquing his North America, his Canada deal and his Mexico deal. And people were relying on those deals in terms of the way they set up their manufacturing. So unless he's willing to criticize his own deals, you can likely do better. But the question is at what cost of ripping up existing deals? And there are other ways of improving those deals without having to create the turmoil that we've seen.
Yeah. Trump always talks about the value of the madman strategy in foreign policy, and I've studied some of this, and I think he likes the term. I doubt has a real understanding of what the madman strategy is. I think he thinks it's something like behave unpredictably, and then people won't know what you're going to do next, so therefore you have an intrinsic advantage. How much value is there? So I'm sure you know a lot about the madman strategy and Nixon and China. Does Trump do anything approaching that? Does Trump at least have right instincts about being a madman?
Look, on that level, as I said, it's very hard to take strategies where it costs you something, even if it costs other people more. That it's like, well, wait a second, was the scene in Blazing Saddles. If you're not careful, I'm going to shoot myself in the head.
Yes.
And people don't believe you when you have a strategy that you carry out if it's going to cost you pain. Trump has demonstrated he's willing to do things that seem irrational. And therefore, that gives him a whole lot broader set of threats than you or I would be able to achieve. And they can be very effective. So, like I said, he can get the world to zero tariffs on the United States quicker than anybody else could have. The only problem is I don't know if that's his objective. And that's this issue of his unpredictability, which is in negotiations, I want to give the other side what they want, not because I'm nice, but because if they get what they want, I can get what I want. And with Trump, it's not clear what it is to give him because I don't know what it is he wants.
Yeah. It's also an easy get out of jail free card or accountability free card. If he was just acting with madness, he could claim, oh, no, that's the madman strategy. We put the word strategy on the end of that, and it, gives it a very respectable sheen. Tell us about allocentrism. Love this idea.
Yeah, so egocentric is focusing on yourself. Allocentric is understanding the perspective of the other party. And one of the things that I tell my students is the importance of being allocentric in a negotiation. In particular, I want to make the arguments of the other side because you can't always get your way in negotiation, but you can always be understood. And people will argue thinking that the reason they're not getting their way is because they haven't been understood. But if I make the other side's arguments, not only do they have nothing to say because I've just made it for them, but they also appreciate that I understand their perspective. And there's something else going on, which is why I've taken a different view. So look at this in the context of VAT. Trump is saying that it's unfair that Europeans are charging VAT on American cars.
The value-added tax, which is sometimes called the VAT tax, which upsets me, like ATM machine. But go ahead.
And the fact is that they're charging VAT on their own cars.
Yes.
And so it's not like they're taxing or tariffing us any differently than they're tariffing themselves. And so if you don't acknowledge that and you pretend you don't understand it, they're going to spend all their time saying, time out. Do you understand what we're up to? As opposed to, yes, I get that. Okay, but there's some other reason perhaps why you shouldn't be giving us these tariffs on cars, or why is this unfair? And so because we haven't acknowledged their understanding by not being allocentric, we end up just yelling at each other as opposed to having a potential for reaching an agreement.
So let me introduce a couple of my observations about subtleties of his behavior. He has shown an ability to understand at least the character, or what he says of the character of leaders of other countries. Mm-hmm. He talks about the Chinese, in particular Xi, being honorable, and says that I know him very well. He'll often say this about other world leaders. I have a lot of dealings with him. I know him very well. And he'll say something that's more or less complimentary, but it's not necessarily about their perspective of their tariff strategy or any other strategy. It's about their character. Is this, should we say, well, that's at least a good thing? Or is that more, this gets in the way of his allocentrism because the best he could do is think that they're, in broad brushes of high character or of honorable character?
Your character also matters. And one of the challenges is when you do a deal with him, you actually have a deal. And so that's an issue. So, for example, the Canadians do a deal with us and then it gets retraded. Or think about Paul Weiss.
The law firm, right, that he made the settlement with, that caved.
And they may have thought they have a deal, but say he calls them up and says, that client you're just working with and defending, I want you to drop that client. What do we think they're going to do now?
Yeah, not a hypothetical, because his deal with Paul Weiss, he did add, they had the deal and then he added more conditions to it.
The whole you getting rid of DEI, even though that wasn't part of the original agreement.
Yeah.
So So yes, I do think understanding character is important, but I also think that having character and being trustworthy and understanding what a deal is when you've done it and not retrading it is also super important, because people have a choice. They can negotiate with you or they can fight you. They can go to the courts, they can go military, and doing a deal is only worthwhile if you think the deal is actually going to mean something.
Yeah. Yeah, but that also gets into, I think, America, we're a democracy, we change our leaders, and the gap between leaders, the delta between leaders is greater than it's ever been. And so that pretty much undercuts not just Trump's ability to do a deal, but Biden's ability to do a deal before him and whoever Trump's successor will be. You know, maybe the next guy will be another Trump or another Biden, and we'll just swing back and forth.
Well, again, I think that we have a general process for changing deals, which is going through Congress, if you like, which is slow and cumbersome and requires some amount of consensus, as opposed to a president just saying, this is what I think the new terms are. And so it's unusually large swings right now is what we're getting.
Yeah. Trump sees the world in binaries, or at least says he does, and I believe he does. And he loves to portray his predecessors as babies, a word he'll sometimes say, very naive and weak. Is it possible to be allocentric and strong and tough? Or those to me, I don't think they're actually at odds. Maybe they seem at odds if you don't understand it. But give me an example of tough but allocentric.
Yeah. So actually, being allocentric, in my view, is the ultimate demonstration of strength, because it says, I understand your argument's legitimate, and here's why you think this. But here are the other arguments out there that are even more important, and they're what I am relying on. And so I don't actually have to denigrate your arguments. I have to show you that mine are more convincing. Let me use an example of trying to take a 3-year-old out of a swimming pool, if you'd like. The kid, you say to the kid, not, we got to leave this moment. And the kid says, I want to stay in there. It's like, I know that being in the pool, being weightless, being able to do somersaults, those are all amazing things, and I'd like to spend the rest of my life in the pool too. On the other hand, I also know at some point we're going to be hungry. And that if we don't leave soon, and I think about how long it takes to get home and make dinner, then it turns out you're going to be really hungry and upset. And so as fun as it would be staying in the pool, I've got this other argument out there that is more important and is why we have to leave at this juncture. And so by acknowledging the other side's true and correct perspective, you're not making yourself weaker. You're, I think, actually demonstrating strength.
In the hypothetical, how old's the kid that you're using words like juncture with?
I think it's important to get those vocabularies expanded at an early age.
Probably true. Their minds are like sponges, and at this point, so is their bathing suit. I want to talk about colleges. There you are sitting in an office in New Haven, and I know Yale is one of those colleges that either are or could be in his crosshairs. I look at what the colleges have done, very similar to what the law firms have done, where Columbia is the Paul Weiss in this example. Mm-hmm. They pretty much caved in their negotiation. And the flaw there wasn't that, you have to do the right thing and academic integrity. It was exactly what your area of expertise is. It was a strategic negotiating flaw in that they thought it was something like a one-off game, and the game's going to keep iterating. And so there's no capitulation early on that will stave this off in the future, I think. And so that argues for fighting more than any of the high-minded calls to academic integrity. What do you think?
Yeah. So there's a negotiation strategy, which is, should I hold some things off in reserve so I can give it to them later as a deal? Or should I do something now that I actually want to do anyway? And let me use the example of diversity statements, which I think were a mistake, which were performative, which were make us a target, just not helpful.
Yeah.
So one view is we keep them in reserve so that when we have to do a deal, we give them up. And I'm giving up something I would have done anyway. It's a little bit like Apple announcing I'm going to put $1 billion investment in Texas, where I had already planned to do it 2 years ago. But
Yes.
hey, I can get multiple credit for this. And the other view is I don't want to give Trump a symbolic victory. Essentially so you have Bill Urey at Harvard on one side saying you want to write the other side's victory speech. So what can you give them that allows them to claim victory? And Trump is all about whether he wins or loses, being able to find some way to say this was a victory. This was my plan all along. And in general, that's what you want to do because you're trying to help the other side come to an agreement and you want them to be able to cast it as a win. At the other side of Harvard, you have Deepak Malhotra, who's saying, no, you can't do that. You basically have to treat a bully with a loss. And you have to make it clear that this strategy, this type of behavior is not acceptable. Mm-hmm. And so those two options are mutually incompatible. And so the question is, what should universities do? And I think we're learning that, we should clean up our house so that we don't have easy targets to go after. We should make fixes that we should have done all along. And then we have to fight.
Yeah. And by the way, the two professors you mentioned, and Yuri's been on the show, they're in one of the 2 or 3 universities, and you may be in another that has one set of conditions or considerations with their $1 billion endowment, and then every other university is probably fighting the bully from a different sloped terrace.
Well, actually, we're in a much worse position than your typical university.
Tell me.
Because one, we're much more reliant on NIH grants in terms of we have a medical school, and so we have a school of public health. And then the other is we have a big endowment to go after. So if you don't have an endowment, the endowment tax doesn't matter.
That's a good point. Harvard's a $1 billion hedge fund with a arts department
$50 billion
attached.
hedge fund.
$50 billion hedge fund with a school of English attached is the old line. But the bigger your hedge fund, the more vulnerable you are to yanking away the hedge fund tax benefits, the endowment tax benefits. Yeah,
exactly. And right now, what we don't know is, is that tax, it's 1.4%. Will it go to 14% or 20% or 30%? And that will lead to fundamental changes in what a university can accomplish.
Interesting. Does your university at least call you up to consider negotiating strategy?
I think my dean has definitely had conversations in this regard.
Because you've gotten good deals for NBA players.
Yeah.
They didn't split the pie. I think they get 60% of revenue, right?
51.
Okay.
And revenue is not pie, but that's a story for another day. But the problem also is which is likely to be permanent and which is likely to be temporary. So I could believe that when sanity prevails, the NIH grants and the overheads will come back to some reasonable level. But if Congress is making money on taxing endowments, it's hard to see how that goes away.
Yeah.
And again, let me be allocentric here for a moment. It's true that we have many people who are graduates of Yale who are now congressmen and senators.
And vice presidents.
But there's also many more people in Congress and the Senate whose kids and grandkids and nephews did not get into Yale.
Right.
And it turns out that there might be 50 people who love us, but there's 500 people who really have no love lost.
Yeah. Shouldn't have rejected those senators' kids all those times.
And it's probably the only time their kid has ever been rejected from anything when it comes down to it.
Barry Nalebuff is the author of Split the Pie, A Radical New Way to Negotiate. He is a founder of the Just Iced Tea Company. He's a professor at the Yale School of Management. Thank you so much, Barry.
Thank you. Now, we never got your limerick.
Oh, yeah. And now my limerick. I would suggest you buy the mint tea or the enjoyment tea And then you could read the limerick, over a roaring fire with the tea to quench your thirst. Slake, I like the word slake your thirst. And you could read you just let the words unspool on the can. But I'll read it to you now, since we can't always have that beautiful vista that I've painted. Enjoy mint tea is a remarkable brew. Its sweetness is not but also not too. Let that sink in for a second. There is no caffeine, so at night you can dream and rise in the morning brand new. Enjoy mint tea.
Thank you.
Thanks, Barry.